Thank you for joining us today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a minute or two just to make sure all the attendees are in before I make a formal start. So if you could just hold on for a minute, and then I'll make a start. Still got a few people coming in, so I will make a start once those numbers level off. If you just bear with us for a few seconds. Thank you very much. Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this, well, I'm looking outside, not quite sunny, but at least the weather's getting a little bit better. My name is Syed Kamall. I'm a professor of politics and international relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. Now, if you're joining us for the first time, or perhaps interested in studying at St Mary's University, we have a wide range of programs in business, sport, law, drama, humanities, education, and theology at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Now, St Mary's is #1 in London for course and teaching satisfaction in the Guardian University's Guide 2020. If you want to know more about St Mary's, please go to the front page of our website for further details. Our website is www.stmarys.ac.uk. So once again, welcome to this is the first in a series of webinars from the Education, Humanities and Social Sciences faculty at St Mary's. Now that faculty also includes business, law and society. And the subject of today's webinar is the economy after Corona, recovery or intensive care, with visiting professors Vince Cable and Trevor Williams. But before I introduce our speakers, can I just deal with a few housekeeping rules? We are recording this webinar and the Q&A to be broadcast later. So please do keep this in mind. It will be rebroadcast later, and I'm legally bound to tell all participants that. We will start with a presentation from Vince and then one from Trevor. Now, please feel free to submit questions during the presentations. You don't have to wait until the end, but of course you might prefer to wait for the Q&A session. Please don't be shy. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can select this option in Q&A. But equally, if you don't want to be shy and you want to give a shout out to your hometown, school or whatever, please include that in your question so we can give it back to a shout out. Please use the Q&A function only for questions. Do not use a chat function. What you should use a chat function for is to share relevant links. Maybe some of my colleagues from St Mary's, if we refer to a report or something, could share a relevant link with everyone, or if you want to report a technical problem. So we can find out whether it's at your end or at our end. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to invite both Vince and Trevor to give their presentations. After that, I will move to the Q&A. And then what I will do is I will ask the questions on your behalf. Now, if there are lots of questions, say we've got 25 minutes left and there are 300 questions, what I'm going to ask you to do is help me by ranking the questions. If you go to the Q&A function, what you'll find is there'll be a thumbs up and thumbs down. You can vote up questions, and that helps rank the questions. You can see them move up the table, as it were, and that helps me choose which questions the audience would like to see asked. What I tend to do when I chair webinars is I tend to alternate between one named question and one anonymous question. So now to our speakers. Sir Vince Cable is a visiting professor at St Mary's University in Twickenham. He's a former leader of the Liberal Democrats Party and also the former MP for Twickenham. He was also Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills from 2010 to 2015. His background is in economics and he's published numerous books in this area. Trevor Williams is the former chief economist of Lloyds Bank, a visiting professor at the University of Derby. He's a rotating chair of the Institute of Economic Affairs Shadow Monetary Policy Committee and is co-author of Trading Economics. Now, Trevor also lectures at St Mary's University and Cardiff Business School. He writes a monthly economic column for Money Facts. He speaks at corporate conferences and events and appears in the financial press and on television to discuss and comment on economic issues. So without much further ado, let's hand over to our first speaker, Sir Vince Cable, and his presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Syed. I think probably the best way to proceed is I've got a deck of slides and I'll sort of talk through them, and hopefully that will be a little bit clearer and more interesting than watching my ugly face for 20 minutes. But let me put up the slides. Hope this works. Yes, there we are. This is my route map. I just want to try and put this in historical context, then talk a little bit about how recovery might happen, something about what that translates into business opportunities and risks, and then some of the big issues which form the debate that's going on around post-COVID. Is it good or bad for globalization? Does it mean more or less state? And then to focus at the end on the specific issue of government debt, or debt in general, the economic implications of that. And I've constructed a little economic model that hopefully will make it clear as I talk through that. Now, major events of the past, I start with the biggest economic disaster I could find. There's a wonderful book by Madison at the OECD who has calculated this using ancient statistics. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire wiped out about 60% of GDP. In modern times, the collapse of the Soviet Union probably is the biggest economic disaster we've seen. But the one which we make most reference to, and probably the one most analogous to today's discussion, is the Great Depression of the United States, which from peak to trough involved a decline of about 30% in the US economy. In more modern times, we've had the financial crisis just over a decade ago, which in those historical contexts was quite mild. I mean, it's a decline of about 5% in the British and American GDP, much worse for Greece, as you can see, but certainly for most Western economy was a decline of about 5%, which we thought was horrendous, and some of us were involved in the political business of trying to clean it up. Was rather traumatic, but again, in historical context, was not a massive decline. And I think what we expect this time, though we don't know, is something a bit like the Great Depression in the United States. Now, a lot depends on the profile of the recovery, and economists are already talking about VUWL. I think our optimism that we could engineer a rapid recovery, a V recovery, is receding, but for certainly countries that were well organized, Europe, Korea and Taiwan, the United States, perhaps China, have got a system for controlling the epidemic, moving rapidly to economic recovery. More probably, I think most of the forecasters are assuming that in the West, the UK, we're talking about a more gradual recovery, unwinding some of the enormous amount of damage that's been done to supply chains, credit systems, stocks. A lighter touch government, more hesitant. We'll hear more about this from the British government in the next few days. The possibility of W-shaped recovery, starting to recover, then not back because the epidemic comes back, or because in Africa and Asia are unable to control it and it finds its way back into our own societies. And lastly, something that probably we do need to think about, which is an L-shaped recovery in which permanent damage is done, and we get stuck in what in Japan is now called balance sheet recession, enormous amounts of debt overhanging the economy and which stifle recovery. So 4 potential there, speculative. The optimists look at the green line. At the end of this year, beginning of next year, we're back to trend. The more cautious approach is the yellow line. Maybe over a couple of years, we're back to where we started. W is, the aborted recovery. And the red line is that, 2 years' time, we're still quite a bit below where we are today. But that's all speculation. Far too early to make serious forecasts. Those are just purely notional ideas. Now, what are the forces for depression and recovery? My smiley face points to eventually we get the lockdown lifted, rescue is happening. Hopefully we shall have more continued government stimulus. Hopefully governments will work together, though some doubts about that. China and East Asia are best placed to lead. And, if we look back to the 1920s after the big flu epidemic and the First World War, there was a fantastic burst of optimism, a hedonistic lifestyle, and very rapid growth. Of course, it all ended in disaster in the great crash in 1929, but we could get that kind of spirit. But in the meantime, we've got forces of depression. We're moving to 10% plus unemployment in the UK and the US and elsewhere. Large numbers of small companies, despite help, being wiped out. Consumption is collapsing. People have less to spend. And if they have, they're frightened about the future, so they're hoarding. Businesses are not investing in the current context. There is chronic uncertainty and a worry that in the United States, with Trump's erratic leadership and the lack of solidarity in the Eurozone, governments are making mistakes that are going to make this all worse. But, there are gainers and losers. I mean, in very general terms, some companies are flourishing in this environment. They're sitting on hordes of cash. The big tech companies, big companies in general, who've got more bargaining power with governments, with their suppliers, companies that have already adjusted to the world of e-commerce, that work remotely already, and are in the digital age. And of course, you get companies that are the opposite of all those things. Very speculatively to produce a list of what I think will be the serious casualties and some of the opportunities. We can see some of this happening already in terms of short-term profit returns, stock market valuations. But if you look down the list on the two columns on the left, we can see where the casualties are, the hospitality sector in general, spectator events, Premier League football, rugby union, cricket, they're all in a state of panic. Travel, you've seen the recent news about British Airways, other airlines virtually on the brink of collapse like Virgin Atlantic. Leisure in general, much of the high street simply can't function. Commercial property markets, very depressed, estate agents not allowed to do any business. And others too. I put up universities at the bottom. You make that was a bit provocative, but British universities certainly rely very heavily on international students who are not going to be able to come and go as they did before, and staff too. But there are some companies that are doing well, can do well. Supermarkets are having the time of their lives, really. The tech companies in general, anything to do with IT services online, logistics companies, delivery companies, the food industry, both on the manufacturing side and farming, lots of stuff around medicine, bioscience, pharmacy, and home entertainment, from games to Netflix to Spotify. So, gainers and losers. There is a lot of pessimism around that the world economy is now heading for a period of disintegration, that the globalization of the last 70 years since the Second World War coming to a sticky end. And I've listed some of the forces on the left that would reinforce that argument. We're already seeing travel collapsing, supply chains being disrupted, onshoring of vulnerable supplies, particularly from China. Even before the pandemic, we saw the Americans resorting to so-called national security concerns to put out trade barriers. The WTO is a very weakened institution, partly again because of hostility from the Trump administration. The Chinese are creating their own internet, what used to be a global system, fragmenting. Nationalism, hostility to China in particular, and even within Europe, the kind of cooperation that we expected hasn't happened. But, you can't be completely negative about this. I mean, there are global companies that will remain global companies. Google, Apple, they remain and they think globally, not nationally. New technology is coming through the system that will have broadly global standards. There are a lot of scientists who are cooperating and ignoring nationalistic politicians. They're just getting on with it. A lot of things happening spontaneously through shared culture, better conferencing, people in the university world doing remote learning on common platforms, and some international institutions like the IMF, rising to the challenge seemingly very effectively. Similarly, there's a big debate about whether we can expect coming out of this a bigger government stake in the economy or a smaller one. A lot of things making for big government, the rescue operations, a degree of nationalization taking place, the controls that are going to continue to exist on and will be strengthened on immigration, possibly with the tracing of the disease, things that we would probably once have regarded invasions of privacy, now being regarded as acceptable through tracking applications. I mean, a lot of things strengthening the role of the state, but on the other, shouldn't assume that will happen. There will be, probably have to be, some deleveraging of the economy and the return to the private sector. And you may get a popular reaction, we're seeing this in the United States, against the government telling us what to do, what I call a libertarian reaction. I mean, I'm living a pretty free existence in the countryside, but I saw a drone coming over the other day telling, trying to track what I was doing. My wife and I were miles from anywhere, but maybe we're doing something prescribed, like sitting down or sunbathing, and people are going to react against the kind of nanny state. Lastly, then I'll hand over to Trevor. One of the things that is going to come out of this is a massive amount of debt by families, by companies, and by the state. The state, of course, is taking on many obligations in the economy. The first chart, which I used in my book After the Storm, takes us back to the middle of the 19th century, and it does remind us that we have been here before. After the Napoleonic Wars, there were staggering amounts of government debt. It declined through the Victorian age. After the two world wars, it went up to what are, by today's standards, staggering levels. And by and large, people didn't worry too much about it. It was gradually eroded by economic growth, a certain amount of inflation, and the kind of debt levels that people started to panic about after the financial crisis, as you see from the bottom right-hand corner, were not, by historic standards, particularly high. So maybe we should relax. Interest rates are very low. Governments don't need to rush into reducing their levels of government debt, though there will be people saying, oh, no, we mustn't let get out of control. To conclude, and I hope not to confuse you, I did, for my own sake, try to put together a very simple model of the kind of interactions that we're looking at. Fiscal policy is going to be governed by the fact that revenue has collapsed and from taxes, massive amount more spending. So government's going to have to issue lots of bonds into the market, borrowing. The Bank of England, through monetary policy, is simultaneously slashing bank rates, short rates, and also buying up lots of government bonds, driving down the long-term interest rates. And I've tried to show how those interact. One of the big question marks is whether monetary policy will become what in the trades called monetization. In fact, whether we will simply finish up printing money. And that is possible. It is happening implicitly in Japan in order to prevent their debt escalating. It could happen here when the QE, Bank of England buys bonds. There's an assumption eventually these will be redeemed or sold into the market, then they stop happening. So we've got a combination of interest rates which are being pushed down, debt service being pushed up, and these in turn will influence how we run budgets in future. They'll impact on growth through the exchange rate, which is a crucial variable, which in turn will influence inflation, which will in turn influence the way in which future money supply operates. I'm not predicting how particular things will happen. I'm just pointing to the major interactions that we need to be aware of as we move through the management of the economics of the pandemic. So I think I've used my 20 minutes and look forward to hearing what Trevor has to say and to fielding your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince. And before I hand over to Trevor, can I just remind you, please, if you've got questions, do use the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function for questions. If you've asked a question in chat, please then try and ask the same question Q&A. And don't forget as well, if you don't want to ask a question, please vote on all the other questions. So that helps me rank the questions when I come to putting them to our panelists. And if you also have the option to ask a question anonymously if you prefer. Trevor, let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for allowing me the opportunity to speak at this event. I'm going to do similarly to, and hopefully I'm sharing the screen, is that right?
Great, that's working great.
I am going to play this from the start, and hopefully, yeah, we should be up and running. So clearly I agree with very much of what Vince had to say. I tried not to cover the same ground too much. My thoughts in some areas are slightly different, but I think that overall we are fully in agreement of the scale of the crisis. So let me just quickly give you my 4 areas that I'm going to try to focus on. Of course, this is a 1 in 100 year event. It's the second one that we've had in 11 years. And so clearly we are seeing an acceleration in the number of what are seen as small probability events, but have a big impact both in our lives and in the economy. So something is going on which has caused them to accelerate, and there's something there will be globalization, increase in the number of people on the planet, our interaction clearly with the animal kingdom, of which we are clearly a part. So it should really be the interaction that we have with the ecosystem on this planet, of which we are clearly integral, but we're top of the apex. This time it's a pandemic, but to note, we should have seen this one coming, because clearly we've had so many urgent medical events over the last 10 years. So we've had SARS, we've had Ebola, we've had Zika, we've had MERS, the Middle East flu. So we've had a whole series of events where diseases in the animal kingdom have jumped the species barrier. So we shouldn't have been surprised, and we should have been prepared for it, but we weren't. So that's one thing to note. The second thing I would say a few words about is the crisis itself, the shutdown of the economy, and that where it's different to the 1920s. I'll make a few comments about that. It doesn't look to me at the moment that we are actually doing beggar thy neighbor policies which led to the Great Depression, but I'll make a few comments about that, some comments about the UK's particular position, as that wasn't covered so much by Vince, although clearly much of what he said will apply to the UK. How do we deal with debt and life after COVID? Would society be the same? What's the new normal? To the context, just briefly, today's figures show that the number of cases around the world, it's over 3 million. The number of deaths is close to 230,000. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the US is currently the epicenter of this crisis. This is the largest economy in the world, the richest economy in the world, and yet it is facing the greatest threat to life of any of the countries that have been affected so far, of which there are nearly 180. So the vast majority of all the world's countries have been severely affected by this pandemic. By the way, to state the blindingly obvious, there is no cure, there is no vaccine. And this will only end when we find a vaccine or when there is herd immunity. And in the past, of course, without science that we have today that we didn't have in the 1920s, it would have only been herd immunity. So the deaths would have occurred. But those deaths nowadays don't need to occur. And so we've deliberately shut down our economy. And that's one of the key things that's worth noting. But I'll come back to that point in a few moments in more detail, if I may. Let me just say a few things more generally about the economics of the pandemic. Of course, they have long-lasting effects on economies through illness, through loss of life, and through societal change. But, if we go back to the Black Death and the pneumonic and bubonic plagues, well, they led to societal change on a big scale too. This particular pandemic does have lower fatalities amongst the young. It is highly infectious, but it isn't as lethal as some of the ones that I mentioned previously, like Ebola, for example. Although for those people who do end up in intensive care or in hospital, the rate of death is actually quite high, about 1/3. But social and political change did come after 1918. It came after World War II, and I may say a few words about that too, because something may happen this time, particularly since nothing happened in 2008-9, which is the end of some post-war World War II consensus. Short-term costs are large, of course, dwarfing any that we've seen since the 1918 flu pandemic. Clearly nothing like as large as that one, because it doesn't have to be, because we're shutting things down. And of course, the economic effects of that were felt later on because of some of the policies that were followed, and by the synchronized nature of the sudden stop that we're experiencing today will lead to a bigger slowdown than would otherwise have been the case. And I'll mention that too, because that's highly important insofar as it won't have the same devastating economic effects, in my view, as it did then. Of course, the economic impact on global GDP is large. According to the IMF, the global impact could be between -3% to -6%, which is clearly large. It's equivalent to roughly around 4.5 to 8 trillion of economic output being lost. So it is a big effect, yet some context is required. In comparing the 1920s to today, we have to remember that the world today is much richer. There is a safety net, there is a welfare state that developed as a result of the post-war events in both 1 and 2, and by the settlement that was reached with society about what the state should do for its citizens. So it is not the same in my view, and you shouldn't maybe try to conflate it too much. The drop in output this time around can be turned around by us making sure that the way that we shut the economy down and open it will mean that the bounce back can be very large indeed. And what we're talking about here, remember, is a big quarterly drop, which is huge, maybe up to 35% in the UK, for example, in the second quarter. But the bounce back can be equally strong, so long as we make sure that we graduate it in such a way that we minimize the chances of a second wave of infections occurring and therefore having to shut the economy down again. But this is not an economic collapse created by economic bubbles, by inappropriate economic policies, by a balance sheet crisis, by over-leveraging one part of the economy, creating conditions where the authorities had to raise interest rates sharply, or by inappropriate policies in the 1920s where they cut fiscal spending, for example, and raised interest rates and made a crisis worse. This is a totally different one. This is a deliberate act to save lives. In saving lives, we save the economy. And that's really important for us to note and bear in mind when we discuss the fact that what's important in this context is how we ensure that we get to phase 2 and start to open up the economy. Just another few things to point to before I move on. In comparing the 1920s to today, the amplification of the financial and real economic effects of the downturn is greater because it's a deliberate effect that we are putting in place. And we are not seeing the sharp tightening in financial conditions persisting because we've taken offsetting action to make sure that it doesn't impact the real economy. There are supply chain disruptions, clearly. There is a sudden stop in demand, but it's a voluntary one. And so we can unwind it in wage, which means that we minimize the disruptive effects of it. And our economies can restart if we do the right things over the coming weeks and months. So the context is clearly still this. It's a highly globalized economy. integrated cross-border supply chains, high share of services in GDP, and it means that the impact of what we're doing accelerated quite quickly, not just here, but everywhere, that the actions which are being taken have been shared, copied, pretty much everywhere in the world. People are doing exactly the same thing. And that's why the amplification of the effect has been so large. But it's also worth noting that the effects are not just economic. Can the way we do things get back to where they were before? There's societal impacts, a new social contract. I mentioned before that, remember, after the First World War, the Second World War, the First World War, we had a growth of the Labour Party. We had a focus on workers' health. Clearly, we had misappropriate global economic policies. We had bigger than our neighbour policies. It led to almost directly, in fact, the Second World War. But after the Second World War, what did we have? We had Bretton Woods. We had a global trade system created. We had the International Monetary Fund created. We had a welfare state created here. We had an NHS formed here. So big societal change came after that event. Is this one any different? Remember that we had the 2008-9 financial crisis. Well, it seems to me that was the end of the period of consensus and the societal contract made after the Second World War. Of course, you had in the late 1970s, early 80s, you did have a fracture which occurred with the UK becoming relatively inefficient, not globalized, too dominated by vested interests, and so you had the Thatcher Revolution. Effectively, it seems to me that ended in 2008-9 with the failure of the financial system by people feeling that they weren't sharing in the benefits of growth. And effectively, nothing has been done since then. And this pandemic has come on top of that. And maybe Brexit was a response to that 2008-9 financial crisis in the UK context. Maybe Trump is a result of that in the US. But this pandemic may lead to another response, in my view. Clearly, in the current climate, we're seeing a political effect too. Vince mentioned this to some extent when he said that governments may be making power grabs, and clearly they are. You've got a couple of presidents for life in place in China, Xi Jinping, in Russia, you've got Hungary, you have a variety of others who seem to be taking this opportunity to grab more power from citizens and hold it institutionally. There's environmental effects. Everyone has clearly noticed just how cleaner the planet has become. So will we tighten up rules on food production, green solutions, think about the climate more? I suspect we will. Innovation is critical, and Vince again mentioned this, that some firms that were already part of the new phase of firms harnessing the technology have actually done quite well out of this, because the procedures that they had in place are suited to people working from home. But firms are working smarter. They're getting new ideas out quicker. They're responding more rapidly to changes that are around. There's more recognition of people. For instance, who are essential workers? How are they paid? How are they compensated for the work that they do? Can we get back to where we were if we have lauded them so much during this current crisis to begin to ignore them afterwards? The power of information has never been more recognized. We talked a bit about, in Vince's presentation, the use of phone technology and the internet. Well, we're going to need that in the recovery phase to trace, to track, to help to isolate, to keep down the incidence of the disease reoccurring. Epidemiologists, data analytics, all much more important. The belief in the expert is back. You need doctors on the panels now, not just the politicians. And it seems to me that one of the effects that might occur is this, almost deliberate act by many that were themselves experts and elites to downplay those that are experts, that did know what they were talking about. And so maybe people will recognize the fact that you can't beat expertise and you need it when you're making big decisions. The country, in my view, will have to grow itself out of debt or suffer lower living standards. Perhaps there will be higher inflation. But the UK faces the constraints of an aging society, and that to me means global openness to ideas, technology, investment, and to people. Let me bring that down though to talking about the UK economy and its effects in a bit more detail before I begin to conclude. And Vince, quite properly as well, showed some of the hits that are taking place in various parts of the economy, and this will echo those same points. But in the context of the projections which have been made by the Office for Budget Responsibility and looking at the impact that this downturn is going to have on our economy. So let's take some of the highlights. So transport and storage, 4.2% of the economy, likely to see a 35% drop in output. Construction, 6.1% economy, 70% drop in output. Manufacturing has been shut down. Over half of the output is no longer operating. Education, 90% of it is being shut down. Big effects that are taking place there. Obviously some responses like this one, online learning, use of technology that is allowable by the spread of the internet. On the right-hand side of this graphic, I just show the effects that this has on the economy. 5.2% reduction in output created by the effects from education, for example. 3% from the shutdown of professional, scientific and technical services. Huge effects coming from there. But note that human health and social activities, not the ones that people usually get rewarded for, not the ones that get lauded about in everyday life, but look, a 50% increase in output, 3.8% contribution to the economy, and an incalculable contribution to saving the lives of so many. So I don't think things will be able to get back to normal after this. We're going to have to value these people, all these essential workers far more, and focus on ensuring that a bunch of things which aren't provided for them are provided in the future. So again, just in historical context, it is true absolutely that this drop in output in quarterly terms will be the biggest ever recorded in these sort of statistics. In annual average terms, of course, the cumulative drops that occurred in the earlier periods will be larger and bigger in the effects that they have on people's living standards and the consequences which followed after. Once we start to return our economy to operation, we should get back roughly to the path of growth that we were on before. And so it is not like the 1980s, 1918 flu pandemics, which occurred in 1919 and to some extent in 1920 as well, and is about a 20% drop overall in output over those 3 years. And then, of course, the misappropriate policies that were pursued, which led directly to the Great Depression, when the US once again shut its economy down and all sorts of beggar thy neighbor policies were pursued. This time it really is different. Vince mentioned this too, monetary policy has been slashed. It's worth noting what the history of our monetary policy is. So, in the 326-year history of the Bank of England, never has interest rates got to 0.1%. US interest rates are zero. There are negative interest rates in Japan, the Euro area, and Switzerland. And this follows periods of ultra low interest rates since the global financial crisis. So we're in unprecedented territory here, with the full levers of monetary policy being pulled. On top of that, of course, central banks have also spent huge amounts of money buying up whole swathe of financial assets to reduce the instability created by the increase in uncertainty that we've seen and the spiking volatility that this crisis means. For instance, in the US, the Feds will expand its balance sheet from $3.5 trillion to $9 trillion. 9 trillion represents 40% of the US economy's annual turnover. The authorities there on the fiscal side are running a deficit of possibly up to 5 trillion. So their budget deficit is going to be about 15% of GDP in 2020. These are humongous amounts of government money. And at some point, they have to be unwound. Someone has to pay for this. And so how we get out of this does matter crucially in the next few years, as does how we withdraw the liquidity, which may lead to increased inequality too, by the way, because the quantitative easing will support asset prices, which means that holders of capital will have once again been rescued by everybody else, which is one of the criticisms of the 2008-9 action by central banks, that those with access to capital saw huge gains. Those with access to incomes have actually seen no increase in real terms over the last 10 or 11 years. So these things do matter. Now we unwind them matters greatly for the political and the economic sphere. Now, let me just talk a bit about the UK in more detail. Our central bank, of course, has done something similar. 200 billion expansion in quantitative easing means that the Bank of England will be holding gilt possibly up to about 345 billion more than they're currently holding at the moment. So it could rise up towards 600 billion. These are big amounts of money. On the fiscal side, well, if you look at 2008-9, in other words, last year, outstanding debt was 1.8 trillion. By 2023-24, because of the measures which have been announced, it'd be 2.4 trillion. So over 400 billion increase in the level of government indebtedness. It is true that after the Napoleonic Wars and after the First and Second World War, debt levels rose strongly. But then remember what happened was that afterwards, growth resumed because those activities which had been turned to military uses turned back to private uses, and there was also a tightening of fiscal policy, and there was also some increase in inflation. And so that's how the debt came down quite sharply. This time it will not come down that sharply because we're not going to, well, we could have the inflation because clearly the huge increase in money supply implies that if we do nothing to tighten monetary policy. But on the other hand, debt levels may remain high because the aging population that we have in this country means that the OBR's estimates of where UK debt was going to be, even without this crisis, was that it would head up towards 175% of GDP if we did nothing about how we funded our care homes and how we looked after the elderly. So these things matter. Let me just say a few final words about why the increase in quantitative easing matters. What it does, and it's illustrated by this graphic, is increase the value of bonds, and what that does is reduce the yield on these bonds which are issued by governments. And as the yields on these government bonds fall sharply, it means that those who are seeking returns from holding assets buy other assets with higher yields. And so it forces up the price and the value of housing assets, of equities, of a whole range of other valuable assets that people can hold in their portfolios. And that means there is then a big risk that if the governments unwind the quantitative easing programs, that there could be sharp falls in the value of those assets. And that creates moral hazard issues. It creates financial instability issues in the future too. So there are big effects from what we're doing, and we shouldn't ignore them. Effectively, it means that in 21 and 22, for example, that there will be no government bonds that yield over 3%, that the vast majority of them will yield between 1 and 2%. And that's just not enough to cover the cost of capital in many cases. So it means that there'll be risk-taking going on in other parts of the economy. And then one of the crucial points which I show here is, what about pension funds? How do they make money? What about insurance companies? How do they get returns from holding assets to pay the claims that may be made on the insurance that they're offering people? What about savers? What happens to them? So these things distort our economy, and they shouldn't be allowed to happen indefinitely. And remember, we've allowed this to happen since 2008-9, and QE was not reversed. And this is part of why we've had to do these huge measures now, and why they're going to have such persistent effects in future. Just to end on a few key points, if I may. So how do we fix this? Well, when the virus comes under control, as it surely will, then we'll have to think about how we unwind this. In the medium term, money supply growth is already in the US heading towards double digits. In the Eurozone, 6 to 10% is possible. In the UK, 10 to 12% or above is possible. The implied inflation from this, if policy is not tightened in about 18 months' time, is that inflation in the UK is likely to rise above 5%, almost certainly will do something similar in the US. And other parts of the world will therefore see higher inflation as a result of this. Higher inflation reduces the income and living standards of lower income people in particular. So I'm afraid that there are real effects from the monetary and fiscal easing that's currently going on, which is necessary in the short term, but we have to be aware that it's hard to unwind these things once you put them in place. And the example is clearly what's happened in the last decade, when we did not unwind much of what occurred in 2008-9. Here's the good news in my view. The pace of technological change is such that we may be able to grow our way out of this. There will have to be some tax increases. There will have to be some tough decisions made about how we do a bunch of things. Some of it may be good. We need to focus on education, on training and skills for everybody. Leave no one behind. We need to be more nimble. We also need to break up monopolies and oligopolies and end this rent seeking that goes on for those that are better connected and are better able to use the system to benefit and enrich themselves. And we need to return to a place where the market economy operates and benefits of growth go to those who participate in it, not just to a few at the top. Well, here's the final point to end on. Let's not forget that the pace of technology is accelerating. It's not slowing down. And so I think that the potential for us to re-energize the market economy through renewed globalization, but crucially a new social contract about how the benefits of that is spread, means that the future may not be as bleak as it has possibly been in the past. I think that's my 20 minutes up, and we have plenty of time for Q&A and for questions.
Well, thank you, Trevor. We've got about 13 minutes left for questions, I understand. So what I'm going to do is move very quickly to questions. Both Vince and Trevor covered some really interesting issues there, particularly recovery, what sort of recovery we're going to have, and what sort of comparisons can we make with the past, and what optimism or pessimism about the future. We've got about 27 questions there, and as I said, we've got about 13 minutes. We're not going to get through all those questions, so if you can help me in the audience now, if you can go to the Q&A function and vote for the questions that you would like to see asked, that will move those up the league table, as it were, and I can start asking them. Vince and Trevor can also see the questions in Q&A. So let me start with Richard Stokes. We were told by Theresa May that there was no such thing as a magic money tree. But when this crisis hit, all kinds of magic money trees suddenly appeared. Who provides this rescue money, and how long can these bailouts continue? Vince, why don't you start off?
Well, Trevor's talked a little bit about monetary policy. I mean, in a sense, QE is the process by which money supply is being expanded. Interest rates, long-term interest rates, have been kept very low. I mean, I think the interesting question, which is being ducked by the central bankers at the moment, is whether we just accept that the bonds which are being bought out by central banks will ever be redeemed. I mean, they will just write off the obligations, which is straightforward printing of money. And this is happening a little bit already in Japan, providing it's done in a controlled way under an independent central bank with an inflation mandate. I don't see a great problem with it. But I think the question which Trevor asked, that we've all got eventually to resolve this issue, that's one way of dealing with it, actually. And I noticed Andy Haldane of the Bank of England the other day talking about racy comments from some people about monetization. And I think probably we just got to have an open discussion about it. It may well be a sensible part of the remedy. There may indeed be a magic money tree, but it would hopefully be controlled by technocrats rather than politicians.
Trevor, can you answer that very quickly? But also, could you close your, unshare your screen?
So, yeah, to answer the question, I think printing money, even monetizing it through the banking system, is a dangerous thing to do in the long run, because as I noted earlier, we will end up with inflation. We're ending up with distorted asset prices. And those are the things that will hit society. We are enriching those with access to capital and effectively impoverishing those who don't have access to capital, relative to those people who are holders of housing wealth or shares, for example. Because the implication of that fast growth in money supply is higher inflation, which erodes the income of those who live from wages. So I think that the effects are pernicious and are detrimental to society and are not as straightforward as just we can let the Bank of England hold it to maturity and the debts. They don't write it off. They hold these bonds to maturity, and then when they pay, the Treasury pays the Bank of England, and therefore you remove the debt off the government's book. That is truth. It's held to maturity. But look what's happened. We've had QE for 11 years. The government still had 345 billion. Comes along another crisis, they're going to almost double the amount that they're holding. So the central bank will now be holding almost 30% of the economy in terms of bonds which have been issued by the government. That is not a correct thing to do because of distorted effects this has on the markets and on the behavior of participants in the markets and investment return that you get from investing in the real economy. And you're allowing a situation where those with access to wealth has a huge share of the growing wealth that's taking place, and you're effectively not rewarding people like your nurses, like your doctors, like your essential workers. So I'm afraid it does have these effects that are not obvious, but are there creating a lot of issues, slowing the economy down in the long run. So in the last decade, we've not had growth. But growth and productivity has been particularly weak, even with these ultra low interest rates. So clearly there's something gone wrong.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question from I'm sure it's not their name, but they are known as Huawei Nova 5T. That's probably the name of their phone. Should the government bail out companies that are registered in tax havens if it helps with the economy? Trevor, why don't you go first and then I'll ask Vince?
No.
Okay, Trevor?
I wouldn't bail out companies that are not crucial to the economy. They should be allowed to fail. The problem we've done with one of the effects of ultra low interest that I didn't mention, which I should have done actually, is that it also keeps companies that are grossly inefficient alive. They have high levels of debt, and only ultra low interest rates keep them surviving. But what they do is they suck profitability away from companies that are coming up with great ideas but are not allowed effectively to operate as well as they otherwise could, because these companies are grabbing some of the profits that should go to them. So I think that we should allow the market economy to operate, and bad business models should fail and good business models should take them over.
Okay, Vince, what about you and companies registered in tax havens?
The French and I think one or two other countries are making their assistance conditional on not using tax havens in bad areas. You know, they're allowing them to use Luxembourg and the Channel Islands, but not more widely. So it's quite a tricky issue, that. The theory is that you don't discriminate, and you know you give money to all legal recipients of help. But in practice, and in order to maintain public confidence, I think government is going to have to discriminate, and tax havens, or particularly abusive forms of tax avoidance, are a perfectly legitimate criteria for discrimination. But they've got to get on.
Great. Claire Tapia next. Sorry, I'll just... Vince mentioned the global business winners, such as Google, Apple, and of course, Amazon. Will these winners create an even greater monopoly or oligopoly in these areas? And if so, will there need to be some state regulation to manage their market dominance? Vince, why don't you start off there?
Well, they are going to become more powerful because they're, you know, massively cash rich. They're in a very strong position in the market. And we've already seen the signs that, you know, they're buying up smaller competitors using the crisis conditions to do that. How do you regulate them? Well, you know, ideally, these are global companies. You need global regulation, but, you know, well, that's not going to happen, is it? It's got to be done through, I think, a mixture of regulation at a European level. The European Competition Commissioner is the only person in the world so far has shown a willingness to tackle monopoly abuse by the big data companies. combined with, national level, UK is going to have to develop a system of protecting consumers, protecting them from, abuses by data companies. But it's highly imperfect because we don't have well government.
Trevor?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Vince's point about you should break up monopolies and you should break up oligopolies. If they're exerting market pressure by preventing incumbents joining the market, then they're clearly abusing their position. I think there are moves to do that in Europe. I think there are moves to do that possibly in the US, even there. I think that it's crucial that we do that because we need some global tax rules, which I think will help to bring them to heel. And there has been lots of debate between the international regulatory organizations about how you can do that. So I think that there are some moves to ensure that they pay their fair amount of tax. But then my final point, though, is I think that the technology will change and eventually undermine these current large companies. We may think nothing is going on to create conditions where the Apples of this world and the Googles are no longer important as they are at the moment, but I think that there are. I think that we can have changes in technology, which mean that, for example, people could own the copyright to their information and they should pay for it whenever they use it. I think there's all sorts of things which will undermine their position over the next decade. Thank you.
Next question from Simon Waldman. What do you think will be the biggest permanent or semi-permanent changes to everyday life once we emerge from all of this? Trevor, why don't you start off?
I think the first thing will be something similar to the Roaring '20s. I think people will be so happy to be able to get back to normal that they're going to be partying like it's 1999. But more seriously, and I think that is true, I think that people appreciate what they have. I think that they'll appreciate being able to travel. I think they'll appreciate being able to enjoy going out and about and the freedom to move freely. I think that we'll value each other more, hopefully, as well. Human beings, I think, will have a bit better awareness of the fact that we live on one planet and that we have to share it and we have to maybe think about the environment more than we have at the moment.
Vince?
It'll be a year, maybe two, before travel patterns begin to come back to normal. And by then, people might just have got out of the habit of hopping on airplanes and using motor cars in the way they did. And the kind of distance communication, which we hadn't really bothered about, just becomes mainstream. I attended what was called a Contravision, international conferencing in the 60s, and the technology never developed half a century. Well, within the last few weeks, it's developing exponentially, and that will change behavior. On the positive side, I think it has shown up a real social solidarity and the valuing of health workers. I mean, it's certainly in this country. In the United States, you've had more division, partly because of the way the president operates. But, the good thing in this country, I think that it has, in a society that was beginning to become very atomized, a sense of care about your neighbors and wider society has become strengthened.
Well, thank you very much for ending on that note. I'm afraid that we have run out of time. It's 2 o'clock. We did promise people to get away. If you have to rush off to another room in your house or you have to rush off to another webinar, can we first of all thank Vince and Trevor? I'm sure behind your muted microphones you're clapping away furiously. Can I thank you all for joining us today? I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Don't forget, if you're interested in studying at St Mary's University or interested in learning more, we have a wide range of programs in business, sport, law, drama, humanities, education and theology at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. More information can be found at www.stmarys.ac.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Your St Mary's. Please stay safe. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, Syed.
No,
bye.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you, Trevor, once again.
No, pleasure.
Bye.